is a moment that some women describe, and if you have ever felt it, you will know exactly what I'm talking about. A moment that arrives not with noise, not with a dramatic argument or a discovered secret, but with silence. A quiet Tuesday, an ordinary evening. The dishes are done, the television is on, the man you love is in the next room, and you are sitting completely still, and something inside you, something below thought, below logic, below the part of you that wants to be wrong, is trying to tell you something. You cannot name it, you cannot prove it, but you feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. That feeling is not paranoia. That feeling is not the damage left over from old wounds, though that is what we are so often told. That feeling is intelligence. And the woman at the center of this story, a woman we are going to call Diana, had that feeling for months before she finally decided to listen to it. What she discovered when she did not only shook her to her foundation, it exposed a pattern so calculated, so cold, so deliberately constructed around women exactly like her, that it would eventually end in a federal investigation, a criminal trial, and a reckoning that nobody in Diana's life saw coming. Not her family, not her friends, and not the man who had spent 2 years building the most convincing performance of love she had ever witnessed. But before we go any further into Diana's story, I need you to understand something about the world she was living in when all of this happened. Because Diana was not a woman who stumbled naively into danger. She was a woman who had done everything right, everything that society tells women to do if they want to be safe, financially independent, and loved on their own terms. She was 41 years old, a regional sales manager at a healthcare distribution company in Atlanta, Georgia, earning a salary that placed her firmly in the top quarter of earners in her state. She had a savings account she had been building since her mid-20s. She owned her car. She was a year away from paying off her condo. She had, through 15 years of focused, disciplined, often exhausting professional effort, built the exact financial life she had promised herself she would build back when she was a 16-year-old girl watching her father sit at a kitchen table in Mississippi with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He's staring at papers he didn't know how to read because the plant where he had worked for 31 years had just closed and taken everything with it. Diana made herself a promise that night. She promised herself she would never be that vulnerable. She kept that promise, and she built something real. And then she let a man into it. And that man, charming, attentive, convincing, had a plan she never saw coming, because the plan had been tested on women before her. According to the FBI's own published data, in 2024 alone, nearly 18,000 Americans reported being victims of romance scams, losing a combined total of more than $672 million. The Federal Trade Commission puts the number even higher. Over 64,000 reports in 2023, with total losses exceeding $1.1 billion. And both agencies report the same demographic truth, documented year after year in their public filings. The most targeted group in the country for this specific type of fraud is women over the age of 40 who are divorced, widowed, or rebuilding after a significant life transition. Women like Diana. Women who have done the work. Women who have earned something. Women who finally, after years of being careful, let themselves believe. I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this because Diana's story is not an outlier. It is a pattern. And by the time this story is over, you will understand exactly how that pattern works and why the most dangerous part of it is that it is designed to feel like love. Diana grew up the oldest of 3 daughters in a small city in Mississippi. We're the kind of place where the expectations placed on a young woman are as heavy and unspoken as summer heat. Her mother was a school teacher. Her father worked 31 years at a manufacturing plant before it closed the year Diana turned 16. She has described watching that happen, watching her father's certainty dissolve into paperwork he couldn't understand, as the defining moment of her life. She did not become bitter about it. She became strategic. She put herself through the University of Alabama on a combination of academic scholarships and part-time work, graduated with a business degree, and spent the next decade and a half climbing with both hands through the corporate structure of a healthcare distribution company until she ran a 4-state territory out of Atlanta and had a team of 12 people who reported to her. She was known in her industry for being thorough, data-driven, and almost impossible to mislead in a negotiation. She read people for a living. She had spent 20 years getting good at it. There had been a marriage. She was 28 when she walked down the aisle the first time, toward a man named Thomas who was charming and ambitious, and who turned out to be better at the performance of stability than the actual practice of it. The marriage lasted 4 years. The divorce was civil, quiet, and deeply painful in the way that only the ending of something you genuinely believed in can be painful. Not dramatic, just heavy. Diana walked away with her finances intact, her name on her own accounts, her independence untouched. She had always kept things separate, that old promise from her father's kitchen table still echoing. She spent her 30s building and healing and occasionally dating and mostly not worrying about it, until one Saturday evening in October, at a charity fundraiser for a children's literacy organization that she had been invited to by a colleague and had almost skipped because she had a quarterly report due Monday. She almost skipped it. She went anyway. And standing near the bar, holding a glass of sparkling water and wearing the relaxed expression of a man who had absolutely nothing to prove, was the man who would become her fiancé. The man this story is about. The man we are going to call Marcus. Marcus was 44 years old, tall, silver at the temples, with a kind of unhurried confidence that does not require an audience. He introduced himself as a commercial real estate broker. He asked Diana what she did, and when she told him, he asked a follow-up question that was actually intelligent, which she later described as unexpectedly disarming. Most men at events like that, she said, asked her what she did, and then spent the next 10 minutes talking about themselves. Marcus did not do that. He listened. He asked questions. He remembered things. The name of her mother's church. The anniversary of her father's passing, mentioned once in a casual conversation months into their relationship, never forgotten. He called when he said he would call. He showed up when he said he would show up. He was generous without making it a performance. The dinners, the small gestures, the thoughtfulness that accumulates into something that starts to feel like home. He proposed 14 months into their relationship on the back porch of a rented cabin in the North Carolina mountains. No grand gesture, no audience, just a ring that Diana later said was exactly what she would have chosen for herself. She said yes before he finished asking. And for the first time since her father's kitchen table, she let herself stop being careful. She let herself trust completely, and that is exactly what Marcus had been waiting for. Before we go deeper into what Diana discovered, I want to pause right here and ask you something, and I want you to take it seriously because it matters. I want you to think about the women in your life right now, the ones who are smart, who are strong, who have built something real and are finally letting someone in. And I want you to ask yourself whether the conversations we tell women are too much might be the most important conversations of all. The ones about money, about financial history, about what someone's life actually looks like behind the warmth in the good dinners and the easy smile. Because according to a study published in the journal Evolutionary Psychological Science, the majority of conflicts between spouses and partners after marriage revolve around finances. Not personality, not values, finances. The conversation most people avoid until it is too late. Diana almost avoided it. She came within 4 months of a marriage certificate. Before we dive deeper into what stopped her, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories, because every week we bring you real stories told the way they deserve to be told. Now, back to Diana. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday in March, over lunch with her closest friend, a woman named Carol, at a restaurant the two of them had been going to for 11 years. Carol was the kind of friend who loved Diana enough to say the thing nobody else was saying. They had ordered their food. They were talking about the wedding, 4 months away. The venue was booked. The dress had been altered. The flowers were chosen. And Carol put down her fork and looked at Diana and said something quietly. She said, "Di, I love Marcus. I really do. But have you two ever actually sat down with the real numbers? Not in general. Actually sat down, statements out, real numbers on the table?" Diana laughed it off. She said of course they had talked about it. Carol nodded and did not push. But she looked at her friend for a moment in the way that people who know you well sometimes look at you when they know you are not being fully honest with yourself. Diana changed the subject. She drove back to her office and sat at her desk for 11 minutes without opening her laptop. And that night, lying awake past 2 in the morning, she ran the same mental audit she had run a dozen times before. Except this time, she was doing it honestly. And honestly, what she had were impressions. The impression of a successful man, the impression of a thriving business, the impression of financial stability. But impressions are created by the person you are looking at. They are not the same as facts. Diana knew this. And by the time the sun came up over Atlanta, she had made a decision. The idea began small. She simply decided to ask more direct questions, to stop accepting redirections gracefully. But the more she thought about it over the following days, the more she understood that direct questions would only give her direct answers. And a man who had been evasive for 2 years would not become transparent just because she pushed harder. She needed to see not what he said, but what he did. She needed a circumstance that would reveal him under real pressure, and so she constructed one. Over the course of a single week, Diana built a story. She told Marcus that her company had announced a restructuring, which was in fact true, and although it had not affected her position, and that her role had been eliminated. She told him this on a Sunday evening, sitting at his kitchen table, and she watched his face carefully as she delivered the news. He was sympathetic. He reached across the table and took her hand. He said, "We will figure it out. Do not worry." She squeezed his hand and nodded and said nothing about the $47,000 she had quietly moved to a separate account he did not know about 3 days earlier. The test had officially begun. What Diana had not fully anticipated was how much the performance would require of her emotionally. Not just the fabricated emails and the older clothes and the careful mentions of financial stress, but the act of watching someone she loved respond to her supposed vulnerability. Why? Because what a person does when they believe you have nothing is one of the most honest things you will ever see from them. She left a fake termination letter visible on her laptop one afternoon, just long enough for Marcus to see the subject line before she closed it. She mentioned with practiced casualness that she had spoken to her financial advisor about liquidating some of her investments. She declined when he suggested an expensive restaurant for their Friday dinner, saying she needed to watch her spending for now. And then she watched. Day 1, he was warm and reassuring. They would figure it out together. Day 3, the weekend plans they had both been looking forward to. A trip to visit her cousin, a dinner reservation at a restaurant Diana had been excited about for weeks, were quietly canceled. Work had come up, but he was sorry. She said she understood. She made a note. Day 4, Marcus mentioned, almost casually, that he had been thinking about the wedding budget and wondered whether they should revisit some of the vendor contracts given everything going on. Day 5, he canceled their Tuesday dinner. He had double booked. Day 6, Diana noticed something that had nothing to do with the script she had written and everything to do with what the test was uncovering. The warmth in Marcus's voice was still technically present. The words were still kind in the technical sense. But something underneath the words had shifted. The attentiveness that had always felt instinctive now felt calculated. And Diana, who had spent 20 years reading people across negotiating tables, felt the shift the way you feel a door close in another room. You do not see it. You hear it. And you know. Day 7. Diana was driving home from her office on a Thursday evening when her phone rang with a number she did not recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, careful and quiet, and the woman asked whether she was speaking to the woman engaged to a man named Marcus. Diana pulled over onto a side street. She said yes. The woman on the other end took a slow breath and said she had something she needed to tell her. And what she said in the next 4 minutes, sitting in a parked car on a side street in Atlanta on an ordinary Thursday evening, dismantled everything Diana thought she knew about the past 2 years of her life. The woman said her name was Renee. She was 38 years old, an interior designer based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And she had been in a relationship with Marcus for just over 3 years. Not casually, not ambiguously. She had a key to a second apartment, One Diana had never been told existed, in a city 45 minutes from Atlanta. She had met his friends. She had spent holidays with him. She had been told in language that Marcus had clearly rehearsed because it was designed to prevent the question from being asked again. That he was not a labels person, that what they had was real and serious and simply did not need a formal title to be true. She had loved him. She had believed him. She had, over 3 years, given him $63,000 in loans, in shared expenses, in an investment in a real estate deal that Marcus said was about to close and make them both very comfortable. It had never closed. And Renee, in who had been uneasy for months, had finally searched his name online. She had found a wedding announcement in an Atlanta lifestyle magazine, a photograph of Marcus and Diana smiling in front of a lake at sunset, and she had spent 2 weeks building the courage to make this call. Diana sat in that parked car for a long time after the call ended. She did not cry immediately. She sat the way she had learned to sit in her father's kitchen at 16, in the presence of something too large to react to right away. Then she drove home. She poured a glass of water. She sat at her kitchen table and she opened her laptop, and she began to do what she had spent 20 years learning to do. She looked for the facts. She was methodical. She searched Georgia property records. She cross-referenced business filings through the Secretary of State's office. She mapped what she thought she knew against what she could actually verify. And what she found, piece by piece over the next 72 hours, was a picture that bore almost no resemblance to the life Marcus had described. His commercial real estate brokerage was real. It was registered, it had an address, it had a website, but the address was a shared co-working space rented on a monthly basis. The brokerage had generated no verifiable significant revenue in 4 years. There were no major property transactions on record, no commission trails. The business, to the extent it existed at all, was a shell, functional enough to be cited in a conversation, credible enough to be believed by a woman on a first date, but not a real operating enterprise in any meaningful sense. What Diana was beginning to understand, though she did not yet have the full picture, was that Marcus was not a struggling businessman with a cash flow problem. He was something far more deliberate than that, and she had almost married him. Over the following 9 days, Diana did what any intelligent woman in possession of incomplete but alarming information does when she is 4 months from a wedding and needs to be certain before she acts. She got quiet and she got methodical. She retained a financial attorney, not to file anything, but to understand her exposure and her options. She quietly removed her name from the joint account she and Marcus had opened 3 months earlier, transferring her portion back to her private savings. She told her sister, who flew in from Houston on 48 hours notice and said very little and stayed every evening while Diana worked, because sometimes what you need is not advice. It is simply someone who loves you sitting in the room while you do the hardest thing. She also reached out, through a professional contact in the legal field, to a private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases, not to build a formal case, but to understand whether what she had found was the edge of something larger or the full picture. The investigator reviewed the documents Diana shared and used a phrase that she has said she will never forget. He said the pattern she was describing was consistent with what he called serial financial predation. Diana asked him to explain that in plain language. He said it meant that the behavior she had documented, the shell business, the multiple simultaneous relationships, the manufactured credibility, the financial extraction framed as investment or shared expense, was not improvised. It was a method, a practiced, refined, deliberate method. And methods that refined are almost never used for the first time. Diana met Renee in person on a Tuesday morning, at a diner neither of them had ever been to before, in a town roughly halfway between Atlanta and Charlotte. They sat in a corner booth and talked for 2 hours and 20 minutes. It was not dramatic in the way that confrontations and stories are supposed to be dramatic. There were no raised voices. There was no theater. There were 2 women, both accomplished, both careful, both shaken to their foundations, methodically comparing the details of 2 lives that had been running in parallel without either of them knowing. The overlaps were staggering. The same weekend, Marcus had told Diana he was attending a real estate conference in Nashville, a claim she had never thought to verify. He had been with Renee at a lake house in South Carolina, the same 3-week period during which Marcus had told Diana He was overwhelmed with a significant deal and needed to focus and might be hard to reach. A period Diana had respected completely without question was the same period Renee had described to her friends as one of the most connected and intimate phases of their relationship. And then Renee pulled out her phone and read aloud a text message Marcus had sent her, verbatim. It was a line about not needing a title for something real, about how labels were for people who were insecure about what they had. Diana's hands went still on the table. She had received that exact message, in almost identical phrasing. Early in their relationship, during a moment of doubt that she had eventually pushed past, she had found it reassuring. She had written it in her journal. What Renee had brought to that corner booth, beyond her account of the relationship, was documentation. She had kept 3 years of bank transfer records out of an instinct she herself did not fully understand at the time. Something told her not to delete them, and she had not. Transfer receipts, text exchanges in which the purpose of the money was discussed, emails from a business email address Marcus had set up specifically for the investment opportunity he had presented to Renee 18 months into their relationship. A paper trail that was imperfect but real, and, in the hands of the right attorney, meaningful. Renee had already retained that attorney, and she had already been told in the careful professional language of a lawyer who has seen this pattern before, that what she had documented was potentially actionable. When Diana left that diner, driving back 4 hours down the highway to Atlanta, alone with everything she now knew, she understood that this story was no longer just about her broken engagement. Something much larger was already in motion, and Marcus had no idea. Marcus had, in fact, just days before Diana's meeting with Renee, proposed upgrading their wedding. And he had come to their dinner with a revised plan, a bigger venue, a fully catered dinner instead of the buffet they had originally chosen, a honeymoon itinerary to Italy that was detailed and beautiful and priced well above anything they had previously discussed. He had presented this while Diana was, in the story he believed they were still living, at her most financially vulnerable. He had waited for what he thought was her lowest point, and then he had proposed spending more. He had not mentioned during the dinner how the additional costs would be divided. He had simply presented the vision. Diana had smiled and said it was wonderful, and she would need to look at the numbers. She had driven home and called her sister and said one sentence, "He is doing what I thought he was doing," because she understood now, on exactly what the upgrade offer was. It was not generosity. It was a test of his own. A test to see whether a financially distressed Diana would still reach into whatever resources she had left and fund the life he was building around her. She had almost been the last woman. She was going to be the one who ended it. Diana confronted Marcus on a Saturday morning in April, 9 days after she met Renee, 6 days after the private investigator's assessment. She did not call first. She drove to his apartment, let herself in with her key, and sat down at his kitchen table and waited. When he walked out of the shower and saw her, he smiled. It was the same easy, natural, completely unguarded smile that had first made her feel safe at that charity fundraiser 18 months earlier. She did not smile back. She placed her phone on the table between them, screen up, open to a bank statement that was not hers. And she waited. She watched something move across his face in the seconds before he composed himself. Something quick and involuntary, like a muscle flinching in the dark. And then it was gone, and he was sitting down across from her, and the performance had resumed. What followed was 45 minutes that Diana has described in the years since as the most clarifying experience of her adult life. Not the most painful, though it was that too. The most clarifying. Because Marcus, under pressure, revealed every layer of his architecture. He did not crumble. He reframed. The account was an inheritance held in trust, complicated. He had been meaning to explain it. When Diana demonstrated that she knew more than that, or the story shifted, a business reserve, legally structured, a technicality of brokerage accounting. When she placed Renee's bank transfer receipts on the table, the story shifted again. Renee was a former relationship that had not fully ended on her side. A woman who had given him money he had tried to return, who was struggling with the announcement of his engagement. And then, when Diana did not move, did not respond, did not give him the redirection he needed, he went to emotion. He said she had violated his privacy. He said he had been planning to tell her everything after the wedding, when he knew she was fully committed because he had been hurt before. He said he needed to know she was in it for the right reasons. Diana let him finish. She sat with the patience of a woman who has already decided what she is going to do and is simply waiting for the other person to exhaust their options. Then she said one thing. She said Renee's name, and she watched Marcus do something she had never seen his face do before in 2 years of knowing him. It went completely blank. Not surprised, not guilty. Blank, the specific stillness of a system encountering a variable it has no prepared response for. She had spent 20 years reading faces across negotiating tables, and she knew the difference between a man who had made a terrible mistake and a mechanism that had hit an obstacle. What she saw in those 3 seconds was the second thing, and she had everything she needed. She stood up. She took her key off his keychain, which was sitting on the counter where he always left it. She set it on the table next to her phone. She looked at him for a moment. This man she had said yes to, this man she had let inside the walls she had spent 15 years building, this man who had performed the most convincing imitation of love she had ever been close to. And she said very quietly, "I hope you find what you are actually looking for." And she walked out. She called her sister from the parking lot and said 2 words. "It's done." Her sister, who had flown in from Houston and said almost nothing for 9 days, said simply, "I know. Come home." Diana drove home, and her sister had coffee ready, and they sat in the morning light, and neither of them said anything for a long time. But what Diana did not yet fully understand, sitting in that morning light, was that the accounting for what Marcus had done was only just beginning. Renee filed her civil complaint in June, 2 months after Diana's Saturday morning confrontation. She had spent those 2 months building the most precise document she could with her attorney. 50 pages, chronological, specific, supported by every receipt, every transfer record, every text exchange she had saved across 3 years. The filing landed on the right desk at the right moment. It triggered a financial audit of Marcus's brokerage by the Georgia Secretary of State's office, which had received a separate, unrelated complaint about the same entity 18 months earlier and had not yet acted on it. The audit opened a window that nobody involved had expected, because what the auditors found when they looked through that window was not just the story of Diana and Renee. What they found was a pattern that stretched back 7 years, a pattern documented across multiple women, multiple financial transactions, multiple fabricated investment opportunities, multiple versions of the same shell business recycled through different names and slightly different stories. What the audit revealed was that Marcus had, over approximately 7 years, received financial transfers totaling more than $800,000 from at least 6 women. Some of it framed as business investment, some as personal loans, some as shared expenses for properties that never materialized. In most cases, the women had eventually stopped asking for repayment because the asking was more painful than accepting the loss. In several cases, the women had told no one, carrying the shame of what had happened to them in private, blaming their own judgment rather than the man who had studied and exploited it. One of those women was a 53-year-old woman from Nashville whom we will call Patricia. Patricia had met Marcus at a charity event, not unlike the one where Diana had met him, approximately 5 years before Diana's engagement. She was a senior administrator at a hospital network, financially stable, recently out of a long marriage, cautiously beginning to build a new chapter. Marcus had spent 14 months with Patricia, had presented her with the same calibrated warmth, the same manufactured credibility, the same gradually escalating series of investment opportunities framed as exclusive access available only because he trusted her. Patricia had given him $112,000 over the course of that year. And when the relationship ended, Marcus withdrew gradually, citing business pressures, the timing, the distance. Patricia had not filed a report. She had not told her family. She had not told her colleagues, who knew her as one of the most competent administrators in her region. She had absorbed the loss the way women in this country are socialized to absorb the evidence of their own exploitation, in silence and self-reproach. When investigators reached Patricia as part of the audit, she had not spoken Marcus's name out loud in 4 years. She testified. She was one of the most composed and precise witnesses in the proceeding, And she said one thing in her testimony, according to people who were present, that stopped the courtroom. She said she had not reported it because she had believed the loss was the result of her own poor judgment. She said she understood now that her judgment had been fine. The problem had been his method. Marcus was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and theft by deception. His attorney argued, as defense attorneys in cases like this always do, that every financial relationship had been voluntary, that the transfers were personal decisions made by adult women, that the absence of formal contracts meant the absence of fraud. The prosecuting attorneys argued that the systematic misrepresentation of his financial circumstances, his business operations, and his relationship status, conducted deliberately, repeatedly, and with a documented pattern across multiple victims, constituted fraud regardless of the informality of the transactions. The case moved slowly through the legal system, as these cases always do. Why there were continuances and delays and procedural motions. Diana gave a formal statement during the investigation and cooperated fully. She did not testify in court. She had decided clearly and without second-guessing herself that she had given everything she had to give to this story and that she would not allow a courtroom to be the place where it ended for her. Renee testified. She was on the stand for 2 days. People who were in the courtroom described her testimony as one of the quietest, most methodical, most damaging presentations of fact they had ever witnessed. She was not emotional in the performed sense. She was simply precise. And precision in a fraud case built on fabrication is everything. Marcus was convicted. The sentence when it came was 4 years with the possibility of parole after 18 months, and a restitution order covering the 6 identified victims. The restitution, as it so often does in cases where the defendant has spent years cycling money through structures designed to obscure it, was difficult to enforce. Some women received partial payment. Some received nothing. Diana received a check 14 months after the verdict for $11,000. A number so disconnected from the actual cost of what she had been through, in lost time, lost trust, lost peace, and the particular grief of having had her capacity for love turned into a financial instrument that she described cashing it as almost funny in the dark way that only profound injustice can be funny. She did not keep the money. Or she donated it to a nonprofit organization that provides financial literacy resources and legal support to victims of romance fraud. She did not announce that she had done this. Her sister found out several months later and told Diana it was the most Diana thing she had ever done. Diana left Atlanta 14 months after the confrontation. Not because she was running. She was careful about that distinction. She had simply decided that the version of herself she wanted to become next was better assembled somewhere else. Somewhere that did not carry the weight of the story she was leaving behind. She accepted a senior position in Denver that she had been considering for over a year, a genuine promotion, and she bought her first house. Not a condo, a house. With a backyard that receives morning light in the summer and snow in the winter, and everything she had not known she wanted until she was 43 and starting the most deliberate chapter of her life. She adopted a dog 6 months after the move, a large and completely unreasonable golden retriever mix she named, with quiet private humor. Evidence. Evidence sleeps at the foot of her bed and destroys throw pillows and greets every single morning with the specific, boundless enthusiasm of a creature that carries no memory of difficult things. Diana says she is trying to learn from him. Sitting in the morning light in her backyard in Denver, coffee in hand, evidence at her feet, she says she thinks about the version of herself who almost did not run the test. The version who had been lying in bed at 2 in the morning, telling herself she was being paranoid. The version who had almost convinced herself that demanding the truth from someone who claimed to love her was an act of distrust rather than an act of self-respect. She thinks about her with tenderness, and she is grateful, specifically, quietly, daily grateful. For Carol, who asked the question over lunch, for the instinct she finally chose to honor, for the test she almost did not run. Renee rebuilt differently, but with the same determination. She has spoken publicly about her experience, in interviews and in occasional public appearances at financial literacy events. Not to dwell on the loss of it, but because she has come to understand something that most victims of this particular kind of fraud take years to understand. That what happened to her was not a failure of her intelligence or her judgment. It was the predictable outcome of a practiced method applied to a well-chosen target. She created, through her design firm, a pro bono program that partners with a financial advocacy organization, and she has made it her particular mission to tell women what she wishes someone had told her before she met Marcus. She said in one interview, in the measured tone of someone who has thought carefully about every word and chosen each one deliberately, "The most dangerous thing he did was make her feel that asking questions was an act of distrust." And once she understood that the people who genuinely love you are not threatened by your questions, that love does not require your silence to survive, everything became clear. Not easier, but clear. And that brings us to what I actually want to leave you with tonight, because this story is not, at its core, about Marcus. Marcus is a cautionary detail. This story is about Diana in her backyard in Denver. It is about Renee in her design studio building something real. It is about Patricia, who testified in a federal courtroom after 4 years of silence and walked out with her dignity intact and her voice fully her own again. And it is about the staggering, documented, federally recorded reality that in the United States in 2024, nearly 18,000 people reported romance fraud to the FBI, losing more than $672 million, with women over 40 being the most specifically targeted demographic in the country. Not because they are stupid, not because they are weak, because they have built something real, because they have resources, because they have, after years of difficulty and hard work and earning their own lives, allowed themselves to hope again. And there are men, and the FBI and the FTC have documented this extensively, who have spent years developing specific methods to turn that hope into a transaction. This is not a love story that went wrong. This is a con that was executed by a professional. And the only reason Diana walked away before it cost her everything is that she had a friend who asked an uncomfortable question, and for once, she let herself hear the answer. So here is what I want to ask you, not as a comment prompt, not as an engagement strategy, as a genuine question from me to you, because I think it matters. What conversation are you avoiding right now? What question are you telling yourself is too much, too paranoid, too unromantic to ask? What quiet voice, the one below logic, below hope, below the part of you that wants so badly to be wrong, have you been talking yourself out of listening to? Diana almost walked down the aisle. Patricia carried the weight alone for 4 years. Renee stayed for 3 years because she had been made to feel that wanting clarity was a failure of love. The most important relationship advice the FBI has ever published is this: the people who love you will welcome your questions. That is not a romantic ideal. That is a documented, practical, investigative fact about the difference between people who are what they say they are and people who are not. Trust your instincts faster than you trust your hope. That sentence belongs to Diana. She said it to her sister on a phone call from Denver on a Sunday morning, with evidence asleep on the couch behind her. I think it belongs to all of us. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what this story brought up for you. Tell me if you have been in a situation where you ignored that voice or honored it, and what happened when you did. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you love, if it made you want to pick up the phone, if it reminded you that you are worth the full truth and nothing less, please share it. Because you genuinely do not know whose kitchen table it needs to reach tonight. I will see you in the next one.